So these are going to be the notes about the ocean floor, but I just want to go in very briefly about a little bit of the life that's in the ocean. Deep in the ocean, there is very little sunlight and oxygen, but some animals do survive. The animals live near vents called smokers, or if you were thinking about when you did your vocabulary, the words were black smokers, and everybody had a hard time because you just needed to call them smokers. Smokers are vents that release hot water into the cold, deep ocean water. This allows bacteria to survive, which then becomes food for other organisms. And essentially, these, just like it says, are vents that are on the ocean floor. So we're talking about very near to the mantle. And that's how you get that hot water because of the tectonic activity down near the mantle. It heats up the water that's down at the bottom and then releases it into that deep, very cold water at the bottom of the ocean. And then it lets bacteria grow. And then from that bacteria, larger organisms can eat and survive. And make sure you know about these. And then here are some pictures of black smokers. Just you can see, here's the ocean floor. And then this thing is almost kind of like a volcano, but underneath the surface. Or underneath on the bottom of the ocean, rather. Now we're going to talk about the ocean floor. So scientists study the ocean floor by what's called echo sounding, just like with dolphins and bats, the way they communicate is through sonar. A device sends a sound signal through the water to the seafloor. Scientists track how long it takes for the signal to reach the bottom and echo back to the surface. And then there's also sediment sampling. Core samples of the ocean floor are taken. The layers are studied to see how climate and atmosphere have changed over millions of years that are shown throughout that core. And we'll talk a little bit more about the sediment sampling at the end. And then there are also satellite observations, which provide a greater range of speed in the mapping process. Signals bounce off the ocean surface, which gives information about what lies beneath the surface. It's slightly higher over undersea mountains and slightly lower over trenches, and you can notice the difference when you look at these types of maps. So here's a picture for echo sounding. This is, imagine the top of the water, and you've got a boat that's going over the top of the water, and it transmits or puts out a signal, and then that hits down here on the ocean floor, and then that signal is going to bounce back up to the receiver that's attached to the boat at the surface and usually tugged along behind the boat. And when that receiver picks up the signal, they really do measure how long it takes the signal to travel to the bottom and come back up, and then they're going to divide by 2 because we only want the depth to the bottom, not the depth and then back up. And they can do that because they know how fast the signal is going to move through the water. And then here's a satellite image of the oceans and, of course, of the world. So if you take a look right here, this is North America. And you should know that this is the Rocky Mountains right here. So the Rocky Mountains are shown as a high elevation. And then you come down here, and then these are the Andes Mountains. So this dark red or the orange color is higher elevation. And then you can see the Appalachian Mountains are much lower in height in comparison to the Rockies. And then take a look up here at Greenland. It's very high elevation. And then also take a look here. Antarctica is pretty high elevation too. And then there are the Himalayas over there. But taking a look at the oceans specifically, you can see the darker blue colors. That's the deeper areas. But if you look here, this is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which we talked about in geological processes. But you can see the fact that it's a ridge, it's showing as a higher elevation, whereas the dark blue areas next to it are much deeper. Or take a look over here. This really black area here is actually a trench right there around the Ring of Fire. Now, the parts of the ocean. The continental margin. The continental margin is the underwater part of the continental crust. The margin consists of the continental shelf, the slope, and the rise, or it could be a trench depending upon what type of boundary it is. The continental shelf is part of the continent that extends from the shoreline to the continental slope. So essentially when you go to the beach and you're standing just with your feet under the water, you're standing on the continental shelf. And then that shelf is going to extend a certain distance until it drops off really fast in depth, and that's the continental slope. That's going to begin at the shelf edge where water depth begins to increase rapidly. And then at the bottom of the slope, you have the rise, which is several kilometers thick and descends gradually from the continental slope to the ocean floor. Not all continental margins have continental rises. Some will have a trench or a really deep area. Again, this is going to depend on what type of plate boundary is there off the coast, if there is a plate boundary. Active continental margins occur when an oceanic plate subducts under a continental plate. And we know that oceanic plate is going to go under the continental plate because it's more dense. So that is pushing on the continent itself, making the shelf very narrow and the slope very steep, which is going to lead down into a trench or a really deep area off the edge of the continent. And that's where you have the trench instead of the rise. And think about the western coast of South America. That's where the Ring of Fire is. You've got the Andes Mountains on the edge of the continent, and then off the coast is a very deep trench because those two plates are being pushed together. And then here's the picture of a passive continental margin. So there's no plate boundary here at the passive margins. Again, think about the definitions of those words. Active is going to have some kind of plate activity, whereas the passive continental margin, there's no activity because there's no plate boundary. This margin is very broad and ends at the continental slope, just like the Atlantic coast of North America. Like when we go to the beach, we're at the Atlantic Ocean, we're at a passive continental margin because you're here on the land, you're staying in your hotel, and then you come out to the edge of the water and you're camped right here with your umbrella, and then you walk out in the water, and then you're right here, and then this shelf continues pretty far out. Generally speaking, nobody typically is going to be out past the edge of the shelf. Again, referring to Nemo, they talk about when Dad takes Nemo to school for the first time, going off the edge of the shelf. And they're talking about they live right here. And then when Nemo goes out to the boat and he's talking about touching the boat, the boat is out here off the edge of the shelf and on top of the continental slope where it gets really deep really fast. And then you have the continental rise, which is where the area starts to flatten out into the seafloor, or what's called the abyssal plain because it's very flat. And then submarine canyons, large underwater valleys, which can be created by turbidity currents. And these turbidity currents are great landslides of mud and sand that speed down the continental slopes. And then those turbidity currents are going to carve a canyon from the continental shelf to the ocean floor. So it's literally an area that's kind of dropped out from underneath of. And then here's a picture, the Norfolk Canyon. So you've got the shelf here, it's underwater, and then right here is that canyon, which was caused by a turbidity current. And then you can see all the extra sediment that got left when all of that dropped out. And then another example over here as well. Ocean basins. Ocean basins have a wide range of topographic features. And an ocean basin is just basically talking about the 4 different oceans. These features include abyssal plains, abyssal hills, island arcs, fracture zones, seamounts, guyots, and coral atolls. I'm under the impression that this is a French word, so it's pronounced as guyots, not guyots. The abyssal plains and hills. The flattest of all Earth's surfaces are called the abyssal plains. And again, this is at the bottom of the ocean where there's literally nothing. It's just a giant flat area. It's going to be really important for you to remember that. Which is composed of sediments from continents that were deposited on this big flat area. So the sediments that are down there have just been washed out and away from the rivers on land. And then abyssal hills are small rolling hills that often occur in groups next to oceanic ridge systems. So you think about the mid-ocean ridge. Near the mid-ocean ridge, you're going to have these abyssal hills. And then the deep sea trenches are long, narrow, steep-sided troughs that run parallel to the continental margins or to volcanic island chains, also called island arcs. And now we're going to get back into the geological processes stuff, talking about the oceanic to oceanic boundaries, oceanic to continental, all that kind of stuff. So an oceanic to continental convergent boundary where the two plates are coming together, the oceanic plate up against the continental plate, you're going to get a trench that forms in the ocean, which will also create a line of volcanoes on the continental plate. Again, the example here would be the Andes Mountains off the coast of South America, and then there's a trench. And then the oceanic to oceanic convergent boundary, two oceanic plates are coming together. The volcanic island arcs form on the overriding oceanic plate. Now we know both plates are dense, both plates want to go under, but obviously only one can. So whichever one stays on top is the one where you're going to have these island arcs forming, and Japan would be an example there. Deep ocean vents and mid-ocean ridges. Again here, black smokers, essentially geysers that erupt under the water, are created along mid-ocean ridges. Mid-ocean ridges form at divergent boundaries and create rift valleys and fracture zones. So again, if you didn't get this stuff when we were doing geological processes last semester, this is the time to learn it again, because you're going to have to know it. Divergent boundaries, mid-ocean ridges, right here in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean is the mid-ocean ridge, and then you also have these fracture zones that you can find other places. Seamounts and guyots. Seamounts are cone-shaped mountain peaks that rise high above the deep ocean floor and are typically found in clusters or rows, just like the Emperor Seamount chain. And then guyots are flat-topped seamounts. The tops were removed by wave action when they were above sea level. So remember, sea level is going to fluctuate. It's going to go up and down. So when sea level was low, the tops of these seamounts to create the guyots were eroded. And then sinking of the oceanic crust, or when sea level rises, is going to lower the tops of the guyots back down under the water. And then atolls. An atoll is a ring-shaped coral island. These form when a coral reef develops around a volcanic island. When the oceanic crust beneath the island sinks, it will go beneath sea level, leaving behind a circle, coral reef, or a barrier reef with a lagoon in the middle. And then now we're going to talk about the different types of sediments that we can find on the ocean floor. So obviously we've talked about erosion and all that sort of stuff on the continents, and that sediment goes out into the bay, which goes out into the ocean and then settles on the ocean floor. So you can have different types of sediments. We talked about sand, silt, and clays that have come a lot from the coastal plain, but this also includes muds and what's called oozes, which are sediments made from microscopic shells from dead organisms. So when things decay and die in the ocean, they're going to get made into sediments, essentially. Terragenous sediments. Terra means land, so these are sediments that have come from the land, or continental rocks and minerals that are broken down through weathering and erosion, and can leave the continents by river or as icebergs that have broken off of glaciers that melt in the ocean water. So think about Titanic. Remember, with icebergs, you're going to have a whole lot of the iceberg underneath of the water and only about 10% of it above. Biogenous sediments. Remember, bio means life, so this is things that have come from something that has been alive. Sediments on the ocean floor that come from living sources, which again can be called oozes. These sediments are made mostly of shells and skeletons of marine animals. Again, as they decay, they're going to get broken down into these biogenous sediments. And then hydrogenous sediments form when chemical reactions cause minerals to crystallize from seawater. The most common types are manganese nodules. These lumps of minerals contain important metals that are important for industry, so we can harvest those and actually go back and use them. And now we need to know why the ocean floor sediments are important. Pay attention. Layers of sediment contain important information about Earth's history, such as the pattern of changes in Earth's climate. Scientists can also study the remains of sea creatures, the history of water temperatures on the ocean floor, and past behavior of prevailing winds. So taking a look at all of these sediments and doing core samples is actually really important to find out what's gone on in Earth's past.